Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt as we work through the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We now turn to Song of Myself, passage number 4. We go from the talkers of passage 3 to the trippers of passage 4. They are often understood as companion reads to each other. Our assumption is that you've been working with us at LearnStrong.net. Down the left-hand side, find the playlist that says Talks with Walt. My hope is that you've already worked with us for the 24 poems of inscriptions as well as the 19 sections of starting from Paumanok, and then of course the Song of Myself introductory comments, and then our discussion of passages 1, 2, and 3. We now turn to passage 4, and really in some ways you can kind of see in hindsight after we hit passage 5 that Whitman was kind of setting us up for the really controversial 5th section. But on our way there, we'll continue with this discussion that he seems to be having with a certain kind of group of people who it's clear he does not get on with so well, or he's not going to be caught unawares by them. In other words, I've got my eye on you is maybe a way for us to see it. He'll call them in this section trippers and askers. Let's just go ahead because it's a shorter passage and just read it and then we'll exegete together. Trippers and askers surround me, people I meet, the effect upon me of early life or the ward and city I live in or the nation, the latest dates, discoveries, inventions, societies, authors old and new, my dinner, dress, associates, looks, compliments, dues, the real or fancied indifference of some man or woman I love, the sickness of one of my folks or of myself, or ill-doing or loss or lack of money or depressions or exultations, battles, the horrors of fratricidal war, the fever of doubtful news, the fitful events. These come to me days and nights and go from me again, but they are not the me myself. Apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am, stands amused, complacent, compassionating, idle, unitary. Looks down, is erect or bends an arm on an impalpable certain rest, looking with side-curved head curious, what will come next? Both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it. Backward I see in my own days where I sweated through fog with linguistics and contenders. I have no mockings or arguments. I witness and wait. Now, it's an amazing thing, the echoes that one will see, the allusions and echoes that one will see in Leaves of Grass. For example, notice the first line, trippers and askers surround me. Go back and read the 22nd Psalm, especially that verse 12, the famous bulls of Bashan surround me. And this idea that David is somehow in the back, David the psalmist, is in the back of Whitman's mind, somehow Whitman identifying with the psalmist, David, from the book of Psalms. And then think about the final line of Longfellow's Psalm of Life. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. Here we're going to witness and wait at the conclusion of this poem. I'm just wanting to point out the ways at 3a that Whitman is constantly playing games. His intentionality is mind-blowing. Of course, his genius is as well mind-blowing, but the intentionality is clear. He's got so many things from his prior study that just kind of finds its way and filters its way into this text. Now, what do we mean by trippers and askers? Well, obviously, you can talk about the word trippers. I'll let you run down all the multiple meanings of this one, but trippers here can mean those who are trying to confuse, right? And of course, askers, that is to say, the ones who want somehow a validation for what is going on here. He says it as well as people I meet. Whitman was a great watcher of people. He enjoyed, Whitman as person, he enjoyed spending time with people and all kinds of people. I mean, he loved, for example, we would call it today, he loved to sit with cabbies and talk with them. But for his day, it was people who drove stagecoaches, and he would love to talk with them. Or people down along the wharf, or the sailors or the mariners, and he would love to talk with all kinds of people. People I meet, The effect upon me of my early life, there's a whole lot to be made of course, later when Freud will want to talk about the impressions, songs of immortality as well from Wordsworth. That idea that from our earlier youth, we draw on all these experiences. Remember, at 37 years old, almost 40, Whitman's going to say there's a lot of life that preceded, and I'm always interested in the people who had powerful effects on me. Tennyson will say it in Ulysses, I'm a part of all that I have met. Similar kind of idea, right? My early, the effect upon me of my early life, and then in the 1855, it was of the ward, here it's now, or the ward and city I live in, or the nation. Notice now we're beginning a listing that we're going to see. We've already seen this in Leaves of Grass. We're going to see it a whole lot more. The latest dates in the 1855 was the latest news. Discoveries, inventions, societies, authors old and new. Notice that's a list of 5. My dinner, dress, associates, looks. In the 1855, he included business here. He took it out for compliments, dues. That's 6 things he's listed. In other words, the stuff of my life. All the things that somehow have constructed this thing that is my life. The real or fancied indifference of some man or woman I love. Whole lot of debate about Whitman, his person. Who are these men and women that he loved that were such an integral part of his life? And how is it that all of those people continue to create who it is that he was? Then we meet our theodicy of our big 5. In other words, the pain of the world. Notice he lists it as the suffering of my folks. Now, if we do any kind of biographic reading of Whitman, we're always made tragically aware of the family that he grew up in, the trials, the difficulties. He had a very difficult father, and his own extended family as well had all kinds of challenges. Whitman knew about the sickness of one of my folks, or of myself. Whitman himself had some illness issues, and then of course later in his life tragically so. Or ill-doing, that is to say when bad things happen, or loss, or he knew this a lot, lack of money, or depressions, or exaltations. In other words, Whitman is, we're not going to call him bipolar by any stretch of the imagination, but when you look in Leaves of Grass, you do see in that mirror of literature, you do see the songs of both of those two things. The depressions are for sure at times there. And the exaltations, well, think about how many times, for example, in that very 19th section of Starting for Pomlock, you saw exclamation points, right? So we have both. He continues, battles. He will say, of course, in the inscriptions that the war in my book of poems are won. The horrors of fratricidal war, of course, think about the word horror as it relates to Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We've spoken about that at learnstrong.net. But of course, the horrors of war, and especially the terrible Civil War, right? The fever of doubtful news. It's such an amazing contemporary line. It's always been the case, no matter when humans lived, that they had to deal with the fever of doubtful news. The fitful events, and the word fitful, we're going to pay attention to the way that one gets used in Leaves of Grass, because there are these kind of jerks and stops. Later it's going to be the pulling and the hauling. That is to say, the way that progress happens isn't always, rarely is it smooth. He continues this with these, in the 55 edition it was they. These come to me. And we've already talked about the influence of the word come as the very first word when you pick up Leaves of Grass in the epigraph, and then of course used over and over again. Days and nights, and of course days and nights is going to be a Hesiod reference. It takes us all the way back to the age of grace. And go from me again. So, in other words, it's almost like the movement of ocean water and the tide or waves. These things have come, then they go away, then they come back, then they go away. But he says about all of these things, but all the things that I just listed, starting with trippers and askers, they are not the me myself. That is to say, notice, the me here is capitalized. Now, as soon as you see this me myself, You flip back several pages, at least I hope that you're doing it with me now, and notice the opening lines of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself. But one of the things that's fascinating in this poem, section 1, is the way in which you don't have me capitalized. Here all of a sudden, we've got me capitalized. In other words, what is it that he's saying? All of the stuff that has happened is not the real me. It's not the real me myself. Well, wait. What is the real me myself? That's the reason that Whitman wants you to read Leaves of Grass. That's the question. In other words, we're going to play around with the great Descartes philosophically, the great Descartes' question of mind-body dualism. What is the mind or the soul? And who is the real Walt Whitman? I celebrate myself and sing myself. Who is the I? That's the very first word of this poem, Song of Myself. Here he'll raise now the question of the body and the soul. And then we'll start to play around with some very interesting language. The great critiquer who we've followed already and mentioned several times, Harold Bloom, will say about these lines now to follow, and of course the 5th section, that they're some of the most amazing language, poetry, that one can read. It is truly amazing. There's all kinds of interpretations of this. My job is to just throw ideas at you. The whole notion of autoerotic kinds of language and the potentialities even of certain kinds of masturbation and these kinds of things have been mentioned by readers here. Pulling and hauling, and obviously can play games literally and metaphorically. I'm just going to share with you guys how this comes to us here, and you get to decide. Notice how he says it. Apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am. Now, of course, the I am is an echo of the biblical resonances, no doubt. Pulling and hauling can mean quite literally, of course, the tug of war, the hither and thither of life. Right? It can also have an autoerotic kind of understanding, especially from the time in which Whitman is writing. Apart from the pulling and hauling stands what I am. Notice the repetition of the word stands. Stands amused. In other words, the soul can have this ability to kind of stand back and look. Complacent is an interesting word. Compassionating is a fun word as well. Idle, unitary. Now this idle makes us think of his loafing as he was mentioning it in passage 1. Looks down, is erect, and you can see how obviously there's a rendering of potential in these lines is very sexual. Or is removed from the 1855, it's joined now in the deathbed edition, bends an arm on an impalpable, tentative, certain rest. Looking, and the 1855, by the way, used the looks, but looking with side-curved head, curious what will come next. Both in and out of the game, and watching and wondering at it. Now this is maybe really 5 lines of the more interesting lines of Leaves of Grass that we've encountered to this point. The way in which, he says, that the real Walt Whitman can kind of almost stand back and observe all of the things that are going on. Looking down with a certain kind of bent arm and an impalpable certain rest of the arm. Looking with side-curved head. Curious what will come next. It's interesting. It's like he wants us as readers even of Leaves of Grass to be fascinated with this question of what's about to happen. You know, how you can kind of look like you're a little bit tentative, you're not quite sure, and you're like, what's going to happen? This is his approach to himself in Leaves of Grass, and he says, backward, I see in my own days, where I sweated through fog. We have to think about our Macbeth, right? Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. Backward I see in my own days where I sweated through fog with linguists and contenders. Earlier it's trippers and askers in passage number 3 when he opens that set of lines. He talks about the talkers. In other words, the naysayers. In other words, all of the stuff, all of the voices. He says, backward I see in my own days where I sweated through fog with linguists and contenders. And then he says it, I have no mockings or arguments. I witness and wait. Now this witness is a key word. I think it's one that you have to circle along with the word echoes. And I think it's got to come back again and again. Whitman is going to invite us to be a witness with him. We'll see this, for example, in his genius poem, Sleepers, where he wants us to look, he wants us to watch with him. And what is it that we're watching? We kind of have this very curious look, side glance look. The language, obviously, of pulling and hauling with the mention of the word of the word erect will as well give us a pause, right? As we look at the language of Leaves of Grass already, we're like, what kind of game is he playing? But notice he calls it a game, both in and out of the game. And to me, I think this is why we love to read Leaves of Grass, because it is play. It's playing in the fields of language, and he loves this play. Let's finish now at 2a. Well, there's so many obvious messages here. Life is, of course, a curious wonder of a game, and he wants to play that one through and through. Obviously, I'm a part of all that I have met is the way we say it in Tennyson's Ulysses. In other words, everything is constructed what has brought me to this moment now. Of course, to look backwards allows one to see certain kinds of patterns, which are also quite useful, right? At 2b, well, notice the listing that we're going to see again and again. We're going to see this often. At 3a, I've mentioned Tennyson. We'll talk about Emerson's self-reliance as well. It's a significant way to as well think about how to approach oneself. And finally, at 3b, when was the last time that you had to stand alone and contemplate your life, right? Or when was the last time you had to deal with the trippers and the askers? And why is it sometimes so hard to witness and to wait? That is to say, to allow your life to be for you a certain kind of pattern study. Well, out of 3 and 4, we move on to passage 5 now, which without question, some of the most controversial stuff we will read in all of Leaves of Grass. I hope that you'll come back to join us. Thank you.